Finding a good Chinese teacher is not easy, but there are many things you can do to get more out of the time you spend with a teacher and, in a sense, train him or her to better suit your needs and preferences. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about training your Chinese teacher, or how to get the most out of the time you do spend with a teacher. Before we do that though, I'd like to announce that there is a pronunciation challenge this month, and it starts on October 10th and lasts until the end of the month. So this is a challenge you can sign up for free. You set a goal for the 3-week period, you report progress, and hopefully you improve your pronunciation along the way. For more information about that, check the link in the description. And of course, as usual, if you hear this after October, well, you can still check out challenges.hackingchinese.com and see what challenge is on when you are listening. This month's challenge also has a prize in the shape of a free slot in my pronunciation course that will open again after the challenge is over. If you want to learn more about the course, head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or check the link in the description. So let's talk a little bit about teachers and how to get the most out of the time you spend with a teacher. And the main reason for having a teacher is, of course, that they teach you things. I mean, that's what a teacher does, and that's what the word means. And in an ideal world, you'd be able to find a teacher who understands exactly what you want and what you need and will be able to give it to you in the best possible way. Learning Chinese would be a journey of wonderment and joy, free of frustration, and everyone would live happily ever after. Alas, as most people who have studied Chinese in the real world can testify, this is rarely the case. Teachers might not understand or know what you want and what you're after, and they might not be able to present that in the best possible way, even if they knew what you wanted. That means that there is a certain room to train your Chinese teacher. And here I mean train them to be a better Chinese teacher for you individually. It does, of course, take two to tango, and that means that your side of the equation is also important. It's not the case that you can just find the perfect teacher and they will do everything for you. But instead, you are the one learning the language, and the more active you are, the better. Of course, the best place to start is to actually have a teacher that is already quite good. If you find a teacher who is bad in every regard, there is no reason for you to train them. That can maybe be the responsibility of governments and universities, but when it comes to your individual learning, you should find someone who already can provide most of the things that you need, and then you can train them, as it were, to work perfectly with you as an individual student. That means that I'm also usually talking about teacher-student relationship from an individual perspective, from the perspective of you as a student. This doesn't mean that the teacher only has one student. You might even be part of a course where there are lots of students, but what matters for you is how well the teacher can provide things that you need as an individual. This episode will be the first in a series, and these are based on articles that I have published on Hacking Chinese. And so in this first one, the introduction, we will talk about teachers in general, and then we will go through different skills to see, for example, how you can train your teacher to better support your speaking development or to help you improve your listening ability and things like that. Before we start talking about how to get the most out of the time you spend with a teacher, it's maybe a good idea to just briefly discuss why having a teacher is a good thing in the first place. After all, I started this episode with saying that this is not an ideal world and many teachers can't actually provide what you want and what you need. So if that's the case, wouldn't you just be better off on your own? Why do you need a teacher in the first place? I think the arguments for having a teacher are roughly the same as those for enrolling in a course, which is something we talked about in episode 66. When you're new to learning Chinese, it can be nice to have a teacher who can provide some guidance, because there will be many things about the language and how to learn it that you simply have no idea about. And of course, you can figure all these things out on your own. You can experiment, you can read, you can try things yourself, and you can gradually figure out the best way of learning Mandarin. And you can do that for 10 years, you can start a website which teaches this to other people, and so on. But all this is very, very time consuming, and the goal with learning Chinese for most people is to learn Chinese. It is not to learn how to learn Chinese, even though, of course, you need a little bit of that as well. So in essence, without any type of guidance, you risk spending a lot of time reinventing the wheel over and over. And this is time you could actually have spent learning Chinese instead. When you're new to the language, you also need feedback. So, for example, when you learn tones and pronunciation, it can be very difficult to hear what is right and what is wrong, and having a teacher who can guide you through this and give you feedback on your pronunciation is very valuable. This becomes even more important as you progress through the language because it will be harder and harder to get honest feedback from people around you. So having a teacher who can point out where you need to improve is very valuable. Teachers can also challenge you to leave your comfort zone and explore other ways of saying things and maybe more natural, native sounding ways of expressing yourself. Exactly how much time you spend with a teacher depends on how much money and time you have available, and also, of course, how much you enjoy doing things on your own. For the purpose of this series of episodes, though, I will assume that you have a limited amount of time with a teacher for various reasons. So, while we're talking about method and how to learn, and in this case, how someone teaches you Chinese, I want to say a few words about the importance of method, because I occasionally hear people who claim that there are no shortcuts and the only way to learn Chinese is to invest the necessary number of hours. And that is true to a certain extent, but it also implies that all methods are equally good, and this is clearly nonsense. There are ways of learning Chinese that are horrible, and there are those that are more effective, and so on. Which doesn't mean that there is one way to learn Chinese and that is the best one, but it certainly pays off to think about method and how you learn, and therefore also how you are taught. It's also worthwhile to say a few things about different kinds of teachers. So when I say teacher in this series at least, I don't necessarily mean professional teachers who have a degree and so on. I mean anybody who teaches you Chinese. So that might be a significant other, a friend, it could be a tutor you find online, it could be a professional university teacher, or it could be a language exchange partner, or whoever else is willing to teach you something. While I think that most of the things that I'm going to say in this series apply to all types of teachers, you do of course need to apply this advice somewhat differently in different situations. For example, if you are paying for a private tutor, you shouldn't be afraid of asking them to do things in a way that you think is beneficial for you. Whereas if someone is just nice to teach you something, even though they don't get paid and they have no obligation to teach you, you can't really demand that much, so you need to be very careful and tactful when you bring up suggestions for how to do things. Naturally, you can also expect professional teachers with an educational background to do more of these things right from the start, although, as I think most of you have realized if you've been learning Chinese for a while, this is not always the case. This means that the teacher needs to adapt to you, but it also means that you might need to adapt a little bit to the teacher. And like I said, it takes two to tango, so this series is mostly about finding ways that are effective for learning Chinese and that you and your teacher are okay with. Another thing I think is worth keeping in mind when you think about how your teachers teach you Chinese is that they have lots of other restrictions that you might not think about. So, for example, it could be that they have very limited amounts of time, they maybe have many students, or they have many classes in parallel, and so on. So just because a teacher isn't able to do something in a specific way, it doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher is bad. It could also be the circumstances that forces them to teach in a specific way. A good example of this is the extreme focus on making progress in a textbook that can be seen in many language schools in China. So the most important thing becomes to reach a certain chapter by a certain month or by the end of the semester or something like that. And whether or not the students actually know or have mastered the content in those lessons, that doesn't really matter, as long as you get to the end of the book. This is clearly nonsense, and I think many teachers know that, but it might be that there is a rule at this particular school that this class has to take the students from this point to this point, and then you have to do that as a teacher, and it's not necessarily your fault that you have to speed your way through some of the content. Another important insight is, of course, that students are different, and it's sometimes not possible to adapt to each and every individual, even though that's the goal. So let's talk a little bit about your role when you are being taught, and then also the teacher's role, and I will give you some tools to evaluate if the teacher is good or not, and I will also point out some things that you are supposed to do to make this work as smoothly as possible. And we will start on your end, i.e. the students, because I think that's the most important one, and it's also the one you have the most control over. The first thing you should do is to make sure you know what you want. Students are different in many ways, as we have already seen, and one of the most fundamental ways in which students are different is the reason for learning Chinese. This is also an area where your teacher should use completely different approaches depending on what your long-term goal actually is. And here, of course, it becomes very important what the goal of the course is. Is there a curriculum? What's the goal there? So someone who wants to speak with a spouse is very different from someone who wants to read the Romance of the Three Kingdoms in Chinese. And if you as a student don't know why you are learning Chinese and what you want to achieve, it's unrealistic to expect the teacher to know this and then be able to cater to that specific goal. So be clear about what you want. You can write it down and you can even show your teacher. And if you don't know, I will provide some useful things that a teacher can do for you in a moment. Next is something we talked about in episode 108, and since we did that fairly recently, I won't say too much about it here, but it is taking responsibility for your own learning. You are the one learning the language, and therefore you should be in charge, and ultimately, if you fail to learn something, that will impact you, not the teacher. So it's important that you don't just relax and assume that everything will be fine just because you have a teacher and that you're enrolled in a course. Another thing you can do as a student is to try to be aware of time quality, which essentially means that you should use classroom time for things that you can only do in the classroom. And the other things, those you can do at home, those you should really do at home before or after you get to class. A good example of this is that you should really preview before every lesson. There are some basic things that you might as well do yourself, and if you have prepared properly, you will get much more out of the time you spend with a teacher. So for example, if you're reading a book and you're discussing that book, make sure you've actually read the book in advance, make sure you know the vocabulary at least somewhat, so you don't have to ask these very basic questions in class when you could in fact have done that on your own. That means that you will have more time left over for things you really can't do on your own, such as talking about the text and getting feedback on what you're saying, exploring different ways of saying it, and so on. Finally, I also want to say that I think it's important to maintain a positive attitude when in class or when you're being taught. And this will make the teacher happy, it will make you happy, and it will make learning Chinese much more interesting. So those were a few things that you can do as a student when being taught. But now let's turn our focus to the actual title of this episode, which is how to train your Chinese teacher. So let's see what you want from the teacher. You can also use these items as a rough guide to what a good teacher is, at least in my opinion. And if the teacher deviates from too many of these, they probably aren't very good, or it could also be that you have hired them to do a very specific thing in a specific situation, but this applies to main teachers who teach you all aspects of Chinese. So the first thing that a teacher should do is teach you Chinese rather than teaching you about Chinese. And this is very serious in many beginner courses where the teacher loves talking about the language. It might be long discussions about grammar, about characters, about pronunciation, and other things. But there isn't much Chinese in this because, of course, since the students are beginners, everything needs to be in English. And I will get back to that in a second, but the point is that you learn Chinese by engaging with the language, mostly through reading and listening, and then by also using it yourself. You don't learn that much by learning things about the language. Well, if you have a specific problem, such as not understanding how characters work, or struggling with a tone or tone combination or something like that, it might help to learn about these things a little bit, and that will have to be in English then. But in general, when you are taking a Chinese course, most of what you're doing should be in Chinese, even if you started learning Chinese yesterday. If it isn't, something is wrong. And this is indeed item number 2 on my list. A good Chinese teacher teaches Chinese in Chinese. This is because one of the most useful things you can get as a beginner and even as an intermediate and advanced learner is comprehensible input. And that means input, listening and reading that you can make sense of at your level. And if you just started learning Chinese, you probably need a professional teacher to provide this because it is very difficult to communicate in Chinese using only a dozen words or so. But it can be done with lots of scaffolding in the shape of images, body language, and so on. This doesn't mean that the teacher is bad if they use English occasionally. They will need to say some things, they will need to explain some things, but if your lessons are mostly in English, like I said, something is wrong. This issue deserves an episode of its own, and it will get one in the future. But for now, I'd just like to point out that one of the most common problems is that the teacher and the students give up too early. You can get a lot of communication done in very limited Chinese, but not if you give up after 10 seconds. This means that patience really is a virtue, and this is not just true for the teacher, of course, it's true for you as a student as well. If you want to speak more Chinese in class, I suggest you impose a Chinese-only rule. And you don't need to do that for the whole lesson. That might be very taxing, because speaking only in Chinese when you're at a low level is very demanding both for the teacher and the student. But you can still do that for part of the lesson. So let's say you have a 40-minute lesson. Maybe you start with 15 minutes only in Chinese or 20 minutes only in Chinese. And after that, you can include some discussion about what happened, maybe sort out some issues that you weren't able to sort out in Chinese, just to make sure that you are up to date and so on. And then you can gradually let this 15-20 minute period become gradually longer, and then in the end you will have your lessons mostly in Chinese. I think such a rule is good both for the student and the teacher, because when you are in Chinese only mode, everybody knows that you're only supposed to speak Chinese, and you will therefore be more creative in coming up with ways of communicating anyway. The next thing I think a good teacher does is to limit the amount of new language. One of the most common complaints I hear about teachers from students is that the teacher tends to equate throwing out lots of new words with teaching Chinese. So the more new words you introduce in a lesson, the better. And this is very far from the case. This is not how language acquisition works. We need to absorb words at a reasonable pace, and they need to be embedded in the context and so on. Having too many new words also means that the input is not very comprehensible, because if every single sentence contains one or two words you don't know, you're very unlikely to understand this sentence without actually sitting down and studying it, looking things up in a dictionary or things like that. And that means that you won't be able to cover a lot of text, or if you're listening, you won't be able to hear a lot of Chinese. It will be very limited, and that is generally speaking a bad thing. Next, a good teacher provides feedback. And this doesn't mean that the teacher corrects every mistake you make, but it means that you get an accurate assessment of how good your Chinese is, what you need to work on, and so on. This is particularly important if teacher time makes up a very small part of your overall study time. As a student, it's important that you ask for this, because many teachers won't voluntarily correct, say, your pronunciation. There are many reasons for this that I won't go into right now, but for example, many students get frustrated or sometimes even angry when teachers correct them, and if that happens to a teacher, they will be a bit hesitant to do so again. So as a student, you need to be aware of this and encourage the teacher to give you feedback by showing that you really want it. You care about your Chinese, you want to develop, and you want their help doing so. Finally, there is also such a thing as too much feedback. Like I said, giving good and accurate feedback doesn't mean that you correct everything at once. So there is a lot of research about giving corrective feedback, and one of the things that we can see is that feedback is more effective when it is targeted at specific issues. So for example, if we take the case of writing, if you hand in a one-page essay of some kind in Chinese and the teacher corrects everything on it, everything from grammar mistakes, vocabulary, handwriting, and so on, this is typically not as good as focusing on one thing at a time. This also means focusing on the same area until you have made some progress. Something that often happens is that the teacher will correct the student in one area, let's say it's a tone mistake in a sentence. The student then tries to correct that, but because they are focusing so much on that specific tone, they will get something else right. Maybe they mix up an initial they are struggling with too. And then the teacher switches attention and says, well, this is now wrong, so this initial is wrong. And the student tries to fix that, and then something else goes wrong. So the focus jumps all over the place, and as a student, this is very frustrating. I think many of you have experienced this already. My suggestion is to blame yourself here as a student and say, I find it difficult to focus on many things at once. I would prefer if we focused on this problem and really try to fix it first. So put the responsibility on yourself rather than blaming the teacher, as it were. And this, I think, is good advice in general when it comes to applying things that I've been talking about in this episode. It's usually a better idea to blame yourself and say that you are unable to do this or that you don't have the capacity to do that, rather than saying that it's the teacher's fault. Well, you might think it is the teacher's fault, and sometimes it really is, but that's not really a productive way of discussing it. But if you put it as a need, something you need in order to be able to learn, most teachers will be able to adapt. So those were some general things about the teacher-student relationship and how you as a student can get the most out of the time you spend with a teacher. In the subsequent episodes in this series, we will look at specific abilities, so stay tuned for that. What I'm talking about here is based, of course, on my own experience, but also the experience of many students I have talked to and those who have left comments over at Hacking Chinese. And if you have a comment or if you have some experience with a teacher that you want to share, head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese and let us know about it. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.